Thanks so much for coming. I would always rather present to 20 interested or 30 interested people than in a big auditorium of 500 where most people are there waiting for the coffee break. So hopefully it will be worth your coming, and we'll be able with a smaller group to have a bit of a discussion during using the discussion time. As was mentioned, my views shouldn't be taken out of either of my current universities or my former employer, the National Department of Health. Apart from academic roles, I do some advising in interesting projects, and this is an area that is particularly interesting. So what actually happened in Australia? And Australia's a funny place, and you'll agree with me for those of you who visited. We are only 2% of the world drug market, but as I was saying earlier, because we sit in one of the world's fastest growing, both in terms of population and economic areas, in terms of regulation and development and so forth, my former body was seen as one of the top 6 regulators in the world, because decisions we would make would influence the whole Asia-Pacific region. You know, countries with population, well, the world's largest country is now India, not China, for example. Other countries on our doorstep with populations of hundreds of millions, such as Indonesia and so on, and large middle classes. So in that way, we do influence more, I would guess, than you would argue from the size of our domestic market. Now, the barriers until July 2023 were that you could only access psychedelic medicines in clinical trials in Australia. And the first issue was what's called drug classification, or scheduling is our word, but it's classification. So you hear of a DEA in the US, and I used to run the equivalent of a DEA in Australia. Essentially, psychedelics were classified as prohibited substances with no known medical use, quote unquote. And I'll show you the exact wording later. It flowed on that our various states and territories who regulate medical and pharmaceutical practice also then put a lot of controls prohibiting the use, except very narrowly in clinical trials. We've explained the role of my former organisation and as the regulator of medicines, but I want to make the point that Australia hasn't approved these substances in individual products. No one in the world has yet. We know that there's, as phase 3 data develops, there will be submissions to the FDA soon, and there hopefully will be submissions to Australia soon. But we do have pathways that allow recognised medicines to be available to either individual patients or groups of patients, even though they haven't been through formal regulatory approval. And they're the pathways that the psychedelics are now available to. And I'll explain just what conditions are around those requirements. So the change that actually was made in law in February the 3rd this year by the TGA was around the classification of medicines. And this determines the level of public access. So a medicine, and it's numbered 1 to 9, and for those of you who are used to the US system, we're in the southern hemisphere, so everything's upside down. So for us, the bigger the number, the harder it is to get the substance. And so Schedule 2, for example, is from a pharmacy. Schedule 3, you've got to talk to a pharmacist. Schedule 4, you've got to go to a doctor. If it's an opiate, don't ask me why, but it's Schedule 8. Schedule 9 were considered substances that did not have therapeutic use. And until the 1st of July, MDMA and psilocybin were Schedule 9. So in law, they were written in as not having a therapeutic use. And that determines the level of access and controls. It determines a whole lot of other things, including how they've got to be stored, how they can be transported, who can prescribe them, and so forth. So what actually changed? So 2 months ago, it moved to Schedule 8. They were now considered a controlled drug. So in law, they're treated the same way, for example, as opiates, but with certain conditions. Only psilocybin when it's used for TRD, and only MDMA when it's used for PTSD. And also, they can only be prescribed by registered psychiatrists, not general physicians. And they have to have had approval from a Human Research Ethics Committee, I'll explain what they are, and then also approval by TGA. So it's not that you can walk to your corner pharmacy and just fill a prescription for these substances and take them home in Australia. So just to drill down, and again, my slides will be available, so I won't, that's why I'm going through them rather quickly to allow time for discussion. So the difference is, where it went from 9, which was prohibited, it actually said in law, and the red and green text is from the legal documents. So Schedule 9, no currently established therapeutic value. That is what it said in law until the 1st of July for MDMA and psilocybin. Schedule 8 actually says established therapeutic value. And in that way, we are the first country to actually say these are not scary, prohibited, marginal substances. They are medicines with established therapeutic value. So in that way, we are, I believe, the first national system to say that. But why are they in Schedule 8, not, say, Schedule 4, where you'd find an antibiotic or something? Because there is the potential to produce dependence and misuse or illicit use. And we can debate the dependence potential or otherwise. I realise there's a range of views, but it sits in that schedule now. It was not a quick decision. The initial application to change its scheduling was well over 2 years ago, late 2020, early 2021. We went to public submissions to see what members of the health profession, as well as industry, as well as the general public said. 13,000 submissions. We had an advisory committee. We didn't write it, we commissioned an independent expert report from pharmacologists and psychiatrists and so forth. Then there came a negative decision. And I'll explain why we changed our mind. And we've been criticised for changing our mind. I actually think it's a strength, not a weakness. If you are always saying, sorry, the answer is no, and you show no willingness to change your mind when evidence or circumstances change, then is that really a good characteristic? I would say no. So initially the decision was actually no in Australia. Then there was a further public consultation, and as you know, there have been a number of new papers, and I don't really want to point out single particular papers, but as you know, last year there was a couple of studies that were more powered than ever before, for example, on psilocybin for major depression, and some of the phase 2 trials were published. And then the positive decision was made and announced on the 3rd of February. So why did TGA change its mind? And you can see the reasons in green here. More evidence was published. And in fact, I often say to people, the evidence base for psychedelics is actually stronger than the evidence base for a lot of cannabinoids in conditions such as acute pain. In fact, the evidence base for cannabinoids in acute non-neuropathic pain is not good. We also, and this was probably the biggest thing, the trouble that regulators have is they regulate products. And as we know from both the Regulators Forum here and the public presentations here, the two are intimately linked. The treatment protocol, the therapeutic protocol, and the drug itself. And yet regulators think, sorry, we can only regulate drugs. We got new legal advice that said that while we couldn't dictate the treatment protocol, TGA could be in a position where they could be either satisfied and approve it or not approve it, especially because of a linkage with these human research and ethics committees. So even though, and I'll explain the linkage in a minute, but it meant that we could look at it as an integrated package for the very first time, and that was really the legal breakthrough. Now, the applicants didn't get everything they wanted, and the controls were more restrictive. So, for example, it was restricted to those 2 respective indications. Now, the message is that this is not written in stone, and it could be sometime in the future, even quite soon. It's not just TRD, it could be major depression. So the indications can change, the restrictions can change, and that's another beauty of the system. Now, what are these human research ethics committees? So in Australia, unlike most other countries, the approval to run a clinical trial is both with the TGA, but the review of the patients, of the design and all that is actually done by these committees. There's over 200 of them, although they specialise. So in this area, there'll be a much smaller number that have and feel they have expertise in psychiatric and psychedelic issues. And so their experience at looking at human protocols. And under this legal scheme called authorised prescriber, initially it goes to these committees, and they look at the submission from the applicant, and then they also have a role in monitoring it if they approve it. So the scheme by which these products are available, and more will be available, is a thing called the authorised prescriber scheme. And in Australia, it means that a specific substance, in this case either psilocybin or MDMA, can go for particular indications to a particular group of patients. So it's not just anybody who walks in the door. And they have to have approval from one of these ethics committees that looks at the treatment protocol. If that all comes together, this scheme, which TGA does not charge for, called the authorised prescriber scheme, allows access. Now, it can't just be any prescribers. So the prescribers do have to be registered psychiatrists who have all the fellowships from the particular professional body. And they have to have had both the ethics committee approval and the TGA approval. Now, the other thing in law, and this is a legal requirement, because I know there has also been discussion about whether these things should be used earlier in the treatment course, especially for TRD, or whether they should even be first line, is that by law, the psychiatrist and patient must have discussed alternatives. They don't necessarily have to have trialled alternatives. So if you had a patient who clearly couldn't tolerate an SSRI, made them throw up, made them vomit, couldn't tolerate, or they got horribly lethargic, and that was documented, it would be possible not for it to be first line. But generally the patients will, again, you could argue by the definition of TRD, having tried 2 substances, et cetera, anyway, for 6+ weeks and usually longer, generally they will have tried other things anyway. PTSD is a little bit more open that way. And as you know, pharmacotherapy for PTSD is, I guess, less well developed. So what do doctors do? Well, they have to, when in doubt, fill in a form. And these are the sorts of things that have to be looked at: the treatment protocol, the nature of a product, the training experience, not just of a doctor involved, but of a whole team. All the issue of how patients are selected, so a bit like a trial, but remember this is not a clinical trial. The treatment protocol, how it will be combined with therapy, and safeguards. And we've heard a lot about safeguards because, as we know, not all patients react well. That's the first step, to get this HREC, this ethics committee approval. So that's necessary, but it's not sufficient. The second step is through the TGA. TGA looks at that stuff, but it also looks a lot more at the product, and it looks at the governance. So in a way, it's almost a check on the earlier work. And you could argue that's a rather heavy-handed regulatory framework, but remember we are dealing with a very conservative profession here and a very conservative government. So there are many, many controls. Again, as I'll show you some statements from media, there was some who said, oh, they've gone crazy, there's going to be people having trips out on the street, jumping off buildings, harming themselves, all these sorts of things. But there's many, many controls. It's got to be only people who, and it's not just any psychiatrist, it's psychiatrists who have the necessary training and skills. It has a TGA oversight. They're going to be, I've used the word likely because it's not written in law, but we've basically said this is not take-home treatment. This is treatment on site. Some Australian states, I remember I said governments are conservative. Some Australian states decided they want additional documentation, but just because the federal national government has got all this paperwork, that's not good enough for their own state. And this is my own state, so I'm allowed to criticise it. So they require additional information, and they have written black and white that you cannot use it outside a clinic because they were worried that TGA did not write black and white. They cannot be advertised. I'll come back to talking about advertising. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't say that you're running a clinic for people with PTSD and you're looking at a range of therapies, but you can't say, and we'll give you psilocybin, and we'll give you MDMA. So I'll talk a little bit more about advertising. At this stage, it's not going to be crude mushrooms. It's going to be pharmaceutical grade products. Now, we haven't closed down other uses. So let's say you want to do a trial for anorexia, and there could be some really great outcomes with a clinical trial. That still goes down the clinical trial pathway. And so the other myth is we haven't closed off the clinical trial pathways. In fact, we think it might even stimulate, because there'll be more pharmaceutical grade and more people with experience in using these products, we think it actually may stimulate research if we get it right. Now, we don't govern the treatment protocols. Our College of Psychiatrists, when they saw this happening, we worked closely with them, but they independently developed what they call a clinical memorandum. I wouldn't call it full clinical guidelines, but at least it's a bit of guidance towards psychiatrists. and it also gives them a degree of involvement and ownership in the process. As you can imagine, like most countries, the psychiatrists were quite divided. I don't know whether a third of psychiatrists support this, probably 2/3 don't and don't want to become involved. And that's fine, but at least we now have a psychiatrist formally involved, and this guidance will evolve. And it states all the things that you'd expect. It's pretty general, it's not very specific, and those of you who are specialists in the area will be disappointed at the lack of detail. But I think it's more the sign that the psychiatrists have engaged that's the important thing here. Now, the decision wasn't universally supported. Look at our media. You know, regulators get criticised if they do things. Others get criticised for being too conservative or too radical. So serious concern. Therapists warn it's no miracle cure. Well, it isn't. Questions remain about the safety. Criticised by mental health experts. Experts disagree. Psychedelic hype could spur self-medication. Going to be a bit hard to get them for self-medication through this thing. The other thing it's also been, and look at the headlines, they're approved. They have not had regulatory approval. I mean, we hope and expect that maybe 2024 or 2025 there will be a submission to us, the same way there will be one to FDA and one to Europe. We usually get them soon after. But this is not a regulatory approval, despite what the media said. And similarly, healthcare professionals, some of them put out various statements. Some of them are quite wrong. So, for example, you're making an exception for any other drugs. No, we actually have hundreds of drugs, not just medical cannabinoids, but a lot of drugs that just haven't been approved in Australia but are widely used in countries like Germany that have been through this scheme. So it's not an exception. We didn't consult. We actually did public and healthcare professional consultations for 2 years. Maybe a particular clinician felt insulted, but they didn't get a personal phone call. But trust me, there was widely advertised public consultations. Despite what we published, sufficient levels of evidence haven't been generated for broad-scale implementation. It's not broad-scale implementation. If anything, I expect the next round of criticism will be that it's rolling out rather slowly because it's taking time for clinics to go through the scheme. So, you know you're doing the right thing as a regulator when you get criticised. And now importing into Australia, again, there's separate parts of the scheme required. There is a lot of interest. The day the announcement was made, there were some companies whose shares went up by 300 or 400%. Local companies, especially cannabis companies that were getting into this area. But import permits are required, again through the other arm. We do allow them, it doesn't have to be patient by patient, we do allow them to be held for groups of patients. And there's other controls around the storage and stuff. But the whole framework here has been built, is the main message. At the moment, the framework for domestic manufacture is still being developed, even though there's companies listed on the stock market but telling people they're making the stuff. Well, they might be, but they can't do anything with it because the legal framework is still being built. And at the moment, we're unlikely to tick off crude mushroom extracts, I should say. We want the things to be manufactured under pharmaceutical-grade good manufacturing practice. And we don't want individual pharmacists to be making their own psilocybin and MDMA products. We want to know dose, purity, all to protect the patient here and to make sure the evidence gathered knows what the input is. One of the real problems with medicinal cannabis is standardisation of extracts, and we don't want to make that problem again. So to finish up, I'm going to talk finally about some of the things that didn't go right with medicinal cannabis in my personal view, and that we don't want to repeat for psychedelics. So firstly, with advertising, prescription medicines, except for the US and New Zealand, in most other countries you can't advertise prescription medicines to the general public. And so, same in Australia. So you've got to run a fine line. We need people to know, especially through their GP and through their psychiatrist, where, especially if they're treatment resistant, might be able to get access. But you can't put a big advertisement out to the general public saying, want psilocybin, dial 1-800 whatever. You can't do it. But they can be advertised exclusively to health professionals, providing that there can't be public access to that information, so in medical magazines, journals, medical online blogs, and of course at conferences like this, and of course during a patient consultation. So there's nothing stopping a physician saying, I've heard about these psychedelic things, I realise that you're having trouble still, I'm going to refer you to a psychiatrist who has expertise in this area. That's all legal. But broad advertising to the general public through social media, through TV, through radio is not legal. What did we learn and what did we get wrong from medicinal cannabis? So there's very significant, remember we're only a country of 26 million, very significant patient access, but some of the things we learned is that because it went through the unapproved pathway, there were fewer incentives for companies to actually apply for approved medicines. One of the really big problems was there wasn't capture of the clinical outcomes. Earlier I said, I don't think the evidence for cannabis in acute pain is very good, but wouldn't have been great with 300,000 to gather that data. Local manufacturers haven't been able to compete with imported products. Rogue clinics that do advertise, and just in the last year there's been over $1 million in fines of various clinics by the TGA, and a significant problem with this illegal advertising. So how can we, hopefully, touch wood, hope this doesn't happen with psychedelics? Well, we really need to try to encourage people to implement patient registries. Unfortunately, TGA did not have a legal power to do that. But there are some initiatives, but the risk is you'll still end up with 10 different registries capturing a percentage, but better than nothing. Draft guidelines, although that was done for cannabis, and the draft guidelines say not very good for acute pain, and yet it's still a major source of prescription, or chronic pain, I should say. Training. The government at the same time did support almost $15 million in research funding for clinical trials and other applications for psychedelic drugs. Recognition of the limitations that, as we've seen, it's not a cure-all for all patients. And that message is really important to communicate. Local industry will be fostered, but I think they're doing it by themselves. And the challenge will be the boom and bust cycles that we've seen many of the cannabis companies go through. And it's encouraging to see that there are companies in it for the long haul and with a strong pharmaceutical background. And, I do hope that some of the international companies will see Australia as an attractive place to put an application in for market authorisation. Still some unfinished business. There are still some things in law. Some states have laws saying if you possess MDMA, you're committing a criminal offence. And so we're having to work with state and territory lawyers to move it from the police will turn a blind eye if you are doing it in a clinic through to changing the law. So there's a lot of old drug abuse laws that still need changing. I'm sure it's the same in other countries. Getting the supply chain so that at every stage, you don't want the truck driver who's driving the material from the airport to the factory getting arrested because he's got a truck full of MDMA. Although in law he could, because he's shipping an illegal drug. So we've got to change a lot of these laws that were written for the war against drugs mentality in the 70s. Local manufacturing, although at the moment we're agnostic to both, and the cost of therapy because they can't get a government subsidy. So my last slide, Chair, was Australia the first country? And the answer is yes and no. Now, it'd be arrogant to suggest that we were ahead of everyone else. We know that a number of other countries, or sometimes it was provinces or individual states, Oregon or, for example, the US, who had a small number of compassionate schemes. But where Australia probably was the first in the world was to actually legally take it from a prohibited substance and recognise it as a medicine, or the two substances as a medicine with a recognised therapeutic purpose, and writing that into black letter law. I think Australia was the first there. Now you could say that's nice, but it's trivial, but it's a valuable signal. Finally, we know the clinical rollout will start slowly for a whole lot of reasons. Going through all those authorisations takes time. There'll only be a limited number of individuals and clinics. It's resource intensive and costly. And one area where I know studies are starting on and is cost effectiveness compared with other treatments. You could argue when you're resistant to other treatments, what's your comparator? And of course, in Australia and other countries, there are very few places. I think that Montreal may have actually subsidised some individuals through their government health insurance program, but generally government is not going to reimburse these products until they have been through the full regulatory approval. So some people say this might be a stopgap system for a few years until we have these products formally approved by the regulator. If so, it's really opened up a few years and we can gather data, and that's really important. Thanks very much, Chair.
Thank you, that was very interesting. We have time for just 2 questions.
Thank you for providing some detail. Thanks for providing some more detail on how it went in Australia. Trying to learn from how it went there, as the data is the same worldwide and only a few, you mentioned Oregon, Australia, have changed their minds. What other factors besides the data are there, in your opinion, that made these change makers actually change their mind? Is it institutional?
Well, I was one of the change makers. I led the organisation. So the main issue was finding a legal, I think the most important thing was finding a legal way where you could tie regulation of the product to how it was provided. And I'm even seeing some worrying signals from FDA and other places that saying, oh, look, we just regulate substances, we don't regulate practice. And of course, as we know, the two are integrated here. And I think that what was really important was finding a way where we could link it to the way in which the substances were provided to the patient and the oversight, but at the same time not breaking our own laws by trying to regulate clinical practice. Now, that's a bit complicated, but we've found a way where it will work. The challenge will be once they get market authorisation, how will that continue? Now, the payers have a better way of regulating that than the regulators. In other words, the people who pay for the therapy. But there are other ways, there can be strict professional controls. I mean, for example, the College of Psychiatrists, where people might spend 12 years studying to try to get a fellowship to enter it, might risk expelling someone who provides psilocybin without providing it within a clinical context that's appropriate. So there are many other ways, but our initial breakthrough was to find a way to link the provision of a therapy with the provision of a drug.
Thanks a lot for the interesting talk. And you presented a lot on the regulation of the pharmacotherapy. However, what are Australia's or the regulatory's views on regulating training? So he's currently allowed to train the therapists. And someone being a psychiatrist and being a fellow, it's better than, of course, nothing, but doesn't make them directly qualified to be a psychedelic therapist.
Just because you're a fellow with your 12 years of training in psychiatry doesn't automatically mean that you can do this. You have to have appropriate training. Now, again, legally, TGA could not specify the curriculum or the course, but this is where the Human Research and Ethics Committee will make a view as to whether they feel those practitioners have had appropriate training. Now, there are a number of sources of training, and you can imagine it's a very active area of organisations saying, we provide training, but those training curricula will be looked at by the groups that are providing the authorisations to the psychiatrists. We couldn't have the initial and direct role. But there is no formal government accreditation of those courses. I'm hoping that there will be some degree through the colleges in the time to come. But one thing as a regulator is you have to be really careful that you don't try to regulate things that you have no legal powers to control.
Hi, thanks very much for that information. I think one of the things that's come up really big in Australia is that the main organization who's very aggressive in advocating and lobbying also runs a for-profit training program. I'm wondering if you can speak to the influence that that organization had, and also you mentioned the evidence base had changed, but for MDMA it had not, and there had only been one additional trial of psilocybin, which wasn't particularly stunning results.
Yeah. The main thing, as I said, was finding the ability to legally connect the two. The evidence base was evolving, and as of yesterday or the day before, it evolved more. But to answer your question, we did have a very powerful and noisy lobby group. If anything, and I said to their executive, and I won't name names, but most of you know Peter and Tanya, I said to them that actually they were probably being counterproductive, because some of our decision makers were actually feeling harassed and overly pressured. And I said to my decision makers, go away and think about the science and think about the law. We're not here to decide whether or not people are overdoing their advocacy or being too aggressive. But I think the lesson is that if people advocate too much and too loudly, they run a risk of being counterproductive. And I've said that publicly.
Not in this case, though.
Did I, thank you. Did I understand you correctly? Health insurance will not cover this treatment, so patients have to
Yeah.
pay for it themselves.
So
That's a major concern.
So in Australia, there is the government systems of health insurance and there's also private systems of health insurance. The government ones will not cover the actual medicine. There are some parts that, for some parts of the psychiatric part, there will be some refunds payable, but fairly small. It might only be 10 or 20% of the whole cost or even less, so a very small amount. Sometimes some individual private health insurers may pay. So for example, there's 1 or 2 private health insurers that are paying medicinal cannabis, and for some veterans it's paid for. But in general, the health insurers are not paying. But I imagine there will be more and more activity trying to convince health insurers, including private ones, to pay. But for a medicine, the government insurer cannot pay until it's been through the full regulation process.
Okay, we have to move on. I'm sorry. Maybe later.
Thanks.